Welcome back. The title of this mini lecture is 16th Century European Warfare, Part 1. And we're going to talk about 5 terms that, as you read more about this topic and as you learn more about it, it can, kind of give you a sense of some of the basics. Let's get into it. The first term for us is Reformation. There's a lot that goes on in Europe in the 16th century, from the early modern Europe sort of transformations out of the era of the Black Death and the 100 Years' War and into the Renaissance, into the era of centralization, which is beginning. There's a lot that Europeans are grappling with. One of the other major factors that we need to account for in this century across the continent is, of course, going to be the Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation begins fairly famously in the year 1517, when Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in Germany. And his intention, of course, was to spark debate, but the functional result was a European-wide conflict and debate over the merits of the role of the church, and of course the eventual fracturing of aspects of the supposed religious unity that had existed within Europe before it. Luther will be excommunicated. He'll eventually have to seek hiding. The Holy Roman Empire, which of course jokingly was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. He's going to try to seek some assistance there, and eventually, of course, Luther's issues and his arguments, centering often around the Christian Bible chapter Romans 1:17, the just shall live by his faith, will lead to some serious responses on the part of the Catholic Church as well, something referred to as the Catholic Reformation or later the Counter-Reformation. Now, it became very particular throughout the course of the 16th century then for nations or states or kingdoms to define themselves on the basis of how they fell in this great religious sort of series of issues. And the functional result, again, is that there will be a number of conflicts that will emerge out of this era. That brings us to our second point. The second point for us is Peasants' War. Peasants' War. Now, in the 1520s, right around 1524, 1525, 1526, you're going to start to see a massive uprising on the part of peasantry, largely in parts of modern Germany and elsewhere. Some of this had to do with opposition to the role of the church, opposition to the role of noble authority in terms of the power dynamics and roles in which the peasants were treated in the region. The functional result of this is that, of course, as nations and as these kingdoms, were able to get greater access to munitions and this kind of thing, of essentially the peasants are going to be put down, right? So they had felt inspired by Luther. Luther kind of sides with the nobles and the lords, and you will see at least 100,000 peasants who are going to die here. And one of the things that this, of course, brings out is that idea of wars of insurgency. It brings out the idea of sort of central actors and sort of centralized states, and sort of this idea of a need on the part of the state to centralize, and in terms of state power in the course of the 16th century in Europe, and also, of course, brutal treatments of civilian populations and what constitutes a civilian and this kind of thing. So, there's a lot of implications there. The third term for us is kind of dual. One is called the harquebus or the arquebus, or the caliver. And this is a musket, or an early modern version of a musket, that will develop in the 16th century. Gun technology is developing here. Gun technology will come to be incredibly influential, of course, with the infantry battlefield in the later 17th and the 18th centuries. In the 16th century, you're still dealing with pikemen and cavalry and a number of other different forms, but the arquebus is going to be sort of part of this process that kind of helps us to understand, kind of how these technologies are going to, again, reshape the battlefield. The fourth term for us is the HMS Mary Rose. All right, the HMS Mary Rose. So the HMS Mary Rose was a ship commissioned in the time of Henry VIII, the King of England, in the early 16th century. And one of the significant aspects of the HMS Mary Rose was a ship commissioned with gun ports put into it. So that idea of putting cannons on the ship. Now, eventually, of course, the arquebus and caliber, and then eventually the musket, and then later the rifle, right? We're working towards the idea of lined infantry forces volleying back and forth. That same concept will predominate in ships as well, eventually. This idea of line of battle and cannon volleying back and forth, right? So the HMS Mary Rose is significant because it's a step, in that way. So around 1510, we're hearing word of this that's deploying within a few years. It's going to be present in some of the battles off the French coast and in a number of other areas as well. The fifth term for our purposes here is the Battle of Cajamarca. This takes place right around the 16th of November, 1532. The battle pitted Francisco Pizarro and a number of Spanish soldiers, of fortune mainly, against Incan forces and the Sapa Inca, or the Incan leader, Atahualpa. And it was a victory for Pizarro. It was a victory for the Spanish. There's this exchange that occurs, so they show up. You're looking at over 100 Spanish individuals. You're looking at a few thousand Incan. The Spanish are armed. The Incas do not have guns. And, the exchange that happens at the beginning, then you see the attacks sort of beginning. The Spanish start firing indiscriminately into the Inca. You start to see cavalry charges and, sort of executions beginning, and a few thousand are killed. The larger Incan army, which was not in Cajamarca at the time, they will eventually flee. But you will see opposition, of course, in modern Peru to Spanish authority. Sort of carry out and continue here for decades. So, the Battle of Cajamarca tells us a bit about engagement in between the Spanish and the Inca. It tells us about the engagement between the Spanish and indigenous people, because often the narrative for decades and decades, at least the Western narrative for decades and decades, was that largely the Incas and others were victims, but of course they fought. War is a product of wars that are fought often are a product of the cultures in which they sort of emerge and engage, and so they fought back, certainly, and had their own agency there. All right. Thank you very much.